Hi, everyone. I know you've all been waiting for a Brexit conversation because this sort of makes me feel quite nostalgic. I was feeling nostalgic a few days ago, but feeling nostalgic about last year's kamikaze budget as well, because it was a year to the day of a couple of weeks ago. And I remember it was one of the busiest periods in the world of tax policy for a while. So just as a quick introduction, I'm Tim Sarson. I'm head of tax policy at KPMG. I also spent a number of years after the Brexit vote trying to help companies get ready for what might have been no deal Brexit. As soon as it actually happened, Brexit that is, everything went quiet and they sort of forgot about it and moved on to other things like pandemics and wars and so on. But it's still there in the background, and no more so obviously than in the financial services industry. Just as a quick caveat, I'm not a financial services specialist myself, so that's why I'm relying on my my fellow panelists here. I might give you a bit of a flavour of what's been happening outside FS too, because there are some of the same sorts of themes. If you think back to 2016 when the vote happened, and in the run up to the vote, I think it's fair to say that the discussion and the debate about what Brexit was actually going to mean from both the Remain side and from the Leave side was pretty weak. Certainly when it came to, I think what it shone a light on was how few people in the UK, even in pretty senior positions, really understood what membership of the EU meant for the UK, and nowhere more so than in the way that our economies, not just through regulation, but also through the way that the tax work, particularly indirect taxes, of course, and simply the way that people operate and that businesses operated, had converged over several decades without really noticing that they were converging. It was just something that happened. And so when we came to the Brexit debate, essentially we were faced with two extremes, one of which was Remainers saying that Brexit would be an absolute disaster because overnight the entire city of London would decamp to wherever the sort of favoured place to decamp to was, Brussels, Amsterdam, Dublin, etc. And that the economy was going to collapse, that the currency was going to collapse, would all be out of jobs. And on the other hand, you had Brexiteers who weren't sure whether Brexit was really about promising more money for the NHS or it was about some sort of great bonfire of regulation and massive divergence from EU bureaucracy and red tape that was going to sort of set the UK free on a path that was more in keeping with our position in the world. And I would say people became none the wiser over the next few years as this stuff was debated over and over in Parliament. But what I think did start to grow was an understanding of what leaving the EU would mean, particularly from a regulatory perspective, and actually what decamping from the UK into the single market might mean. And that's really what I want to talk about today and what I want to ask the panelists about. So the question is, now that Brexit has been in place for a few years, albeit somewhat disturbed by things like the COVID pandemic, to what extent has the UK economy action and has the way that we regulate the UK economy, and particularly as the way that taxation works, diverged? To what extent has the government made use of the Brexit freedoms that it was looking for? What might be over the horizon there? And then what's that meant for the position of the City of London and the UK economy more broadly, and our relationship with the EU? And we'll be using a few sort of crystal balls as well to have a think about where things might go over time, because I think it's fair to say we're still fairly early on in the Brexit process. So, as already been introduced, we have Kunka, Tapiwa, and Patrick here. So coming at this from slightly different perspectives, working in slightly different bits of the industry. Maybe if we could start with each of you giving a bit of an introduction to who you are, what you do, and what your focus is and your interest in Brexit. So maybe starting at the far end with Kunka.
Yes, hello also from my side. My name is Konka, and I'm working as an advisor to the German Ministry of Finance. I'm dealing there with the OECD to pure solution. I'm in charge of that reform. I also coordinate all tax-related topics within the G7 and G20, and I'm in charge of many EU regulations. Maybe a few words about myself. Before joining the Ministry of Finance, I did my PhD at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, State Business School, University of Oxford, and University of California, Berkeley. And this probably shows that I have a strong connection with the UK. I mean, not only because of my prior education, but also because of the fact that I have many friends and colleagues working and living here. So this is a topic like Brexit close to my heart. Yeah, I don't know whether this will be the European perspective, the German perspective, or probably even a personal perspective, but let's see. And I mean, after you introduce yourself, maybe I can say a few words about my perspective on the convergence and divergence, but yes, please.
Okay. My name is Tapiwa Mashingaidze. I am responsible for product development and fund structuring at a firm called Alcentra, which is an alternative credit provider, like in the private credit space. We're wholly owned by the Franklin Templeton Group. So my primary responsibility is to determine, from a tax perspective, where we're going to locate fund vehicles and how it is that we're going to approach investments. So what Brexit does is it shuts down and it opens up for, say, someone in my position. And rather than speak theoretically about it, I will just go through, when it comes my turn to speak, some of the practical considerations that some of us on the front edge of finance face when a country like the UK decides to sever itself from its biggest market. And as I phrase it that way, you can see what my bias is.
Thanks, Uphold. So my name is Patrick Reedy. I'm responsible for the Capital Group's Europe and Asian product and operational tax teams and market access team. As you can tell from my accent, I'm Irish, but I live in Switzerland. So neutrality is probably something I would describe about my interest in this topic. I actually think it's the wrong question, EU 1, UK 0 when it comes to post-Brexit. I'm going to bring a view that's slightly about how it doesn't really matter about post-Brexit, what things could be done in the fund industry to actually develop opportunities to enhance the attractability of UK funds. So not really linked to Brexit itself, but trying to disconnect it that it's not Brexit versus this. We can still do it without Brexit having happened in the first place.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. And I think it's an important perspective, because one thing that we have all learned since Brexit, it wasn't the be all and end all. We were a little bit too laser focused on Brexit being the entire determinant of the future of Britain and Europe, and it's very clearly not, as we've seen since. So starting with you, Kunke, and interesting to get your perspective, both from a German point of view, a European point of view, and a personal point of view, on this question of divergence versus continued convergence. What have you actually seen in terms of the UK position? And that's both more broadly in wider regulation for financial services, but also in terms of tax?
Okay, yes, thank you for this question. I would try to give a short overview of this. I think it's clear for everybody that Brexit has led to a seismic shift in the financial services sector, creating this very complex combination between, of divergence and convergence between the UK and the EU. Following Brexit, the UK faced three main challenges. The first one was to reform the domestic institutional framework of policymaking in finance following the repatriation of these competences into the national level. The second one was to determine the status of existing EU regulation already incorporated into national regulation and deciding which parts to keep and which ones to reform. And the third one was just to set out a future course for UK financial policy, ensuring greater clarity over the extent to which this would entail convergence or divergence from the EU or from the future EU rules. Yes, I can say that the divergence is apparent in taxation frameworks. And the intention or the hope of the UK was that they can try to secure the autonomy in order to set own rules. because the idea is that this autonomy could allow the UK to tailor certain tax policies to its specific economic needs. I can say that, for example, regarding the treatment of financial products and services, the UK has tried to streamline regulations, promoting innovation and flexibility, while the EU has inclined towards a more probably cautious and prescriptive approach, emphasizing the stability over dynamism. And for me, the clearest evidence of the UK's intention to diverge from existing EU rules through less stringent regulation probably comes from capital markets and non-banking financial institutions such as investment funds. And they do this by relaxing regulatory requirements as currently stipulated in the EU's Markets in Financial Instruments Directive 2. And probably UK may also be or internationally diverge from EU practice by imposing tougher bank capital and liquidity requirements on its own banks. So we'll see about it. So when it comes to digital finance, over the last years, the EU has issued stringent new rules for crypto finance. For example, the 2022 Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation. By contrast, UK regulators have been a little bit slower probably there. But I think at that point, I have to say that, I mean, we can't just concentrate on national policies because, for example, at the EU, at the OECD level, a lot of things have been happening in that field, but also at the level of the UN. And UK is playing also a major part in those G7 or G20 discussions because, I mean, I participate in these discussions and I know that, I mean, they contribute a lot. And this is basically connected with this remarkable shift in the prominence of international tax policy. I have the feeling that it's something that is happening. I mean, because international tax policy probably somehow shapes the national tax framework. And we can see this in the UK, we can see this in Germany, but I think this is a global trend. It makes sense because of the whole globalization and digitalization of the economy. I mean, they pose many challenges and there are like a lot of challenges and then you need a global solution. So I think that it makes a lot of sense. So what I want to say is that, of course, the UK is not part of the European Union anymore, but still, I mean, and yes, of course, you have the freedom because you're not bound by the EU directives, but at the same time, there are like many other processes at the international level, OECD, UN, and so on. And then from that perspective, the UK is still a little bit bound. And also interesting, I think that shortly after Brexit, a lot of people were speculating that London might become an offshore center. But at the same time, we see now that the UK is one of the early adopters of the global effective minimum tax rate. I mean, there are like many reasons for this, but you see that, again, like the international process somehow determines this. And maybe one last remark from my side about this. So it's not only about divergence. I think that there have been also some convergence efforts. And you can see this, for example, in the trade and cooperation agreement, which is, I think, a good illustration of this shared interest. And overall, I believe that divergence and convergence between the UK and EU, yeah, it's a very, I mean, it reflects a delicate balancing act. And of course, both sides try to preserve their economic interests, while at the same time also try to adapt to the new reality.
And just if I may, on that last point, where would you say sort of EU morale is when it comes to the view of the UK? Because I know there was certainly fear following the vote that the UK was going to be a bit of an awkward squad, essentially undercutting important regulation just offshore and therefore undermining the coherence of and the sort of power of EU capital markets. So is that same fear there now, or is there sort of more a feeling of reassurance that the UK hasn't gone wild?
But I mean, even if I look at the title like halftime EU, UK, I think it's not a competition. I mean, you're not opponents. I think that that's why I wanted to emphasize on the last point about the convergence. So I think the idea is like, how can we make the best out of it? You know, like, again, keeping in mind that we all have different economic interests. But I think the focus shouldn't only be on the divergence. It could be also on the convergence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. And Tapiwa, you mentioned obviously you're facing the day-to-day effects of divergence, of changes in regulatory frameworks and so on every day. So will you talk us through how that feels and what it means for your day job? What are the sort of the pros and cons of what you've seen so far?
Well, I was interested in what, or the sort of axes that Konka set out of divergence versus convergence, as well as dynamism versus stability, with the UK or the pure Brexit view being about divergence and dynamism, that we would very much fall on those sides. And you made the point that like we're free from the directives, but we're not free from the directives is the point that I would say on a day-to-day basis. So from my perspective, in determining, say, for example, where a fund is located, I am looking at the underlying strategy, i.e. the instruments that we're going to be investing in. I'm on the alternative side of the spectrum, so non-UCITS, but even if I were UCITS, that's a directive. I would have to stick to the UCITS directive, right, if I were to manage a UCITS fund. On the alternative side, if I'm investing, say, for example, in German loans, I need to know like what ATAD 3 says about loan origination. So there's no escaping the directives. What we've lost, I would say, is the ability to inform those. And one thing that I would say, and it's going to be a room where we're probably going to trash the Treasury and trash the UK quite a bit. But what I would say in support of the UK is that we're quite good at financial regulation. We're quite good at understanding what the implications of drafting a regulation is from the perspective of both the distribution as well as the manufacturing of product. What we have taken away from the EU, and there's a live example now with the long-term asset fund, which has been developed in the EU about 5 years ago, and the UK has developed an equivalent. When you put the two products next to each other, the UK one, I would say from a manufacturer's perspective, is far superior to the European one. It would have been nice to be in the room when the European one was being developed, such that like we could have informed that. And from a day-to-day perspective, those are the frustrations that I find, is that there are these very, very good ideas in the UK that we're not able to communicate through to the European level, but we're still sort of bound by whatever comes out of Europe in terms of the directives, which is quite sad.
So, yeah, so it's not just a case of duplication of red tape, which is something that I've heard from a number of industries where, okay, the UK might be diverging, but we've still got to comply with the EU rules, and now we've got the UK rules to comply with. But it's also that those EU rules could have been a bit better if everyone had got around the tech. The analogy I think is quite useful when we think about financial services regulation and the EU is imagine if France left the EU and the EU was then left deciding how to regulate wine appellations, for example. It would be missing the biggest producer or borderline biggest producer in the, and that's kind of what's happened here, or you know, pop music or whatever for the UK. So it does make it difficult, I think. And Patrick, you I think in your opening remarks, you said, well, it's not all about divergence, convergence, EU, etc. There's a whole bunch of other things going on. But in specifically in terms of your experience of what Brexit has meant for your sort of day-to-day job, has it just made things more complicated and more difficult? Are there any benefits that you've seen?
Thanks. Yeah, I think the EU one, as I said, UK nil kind of title is a bit misleading in the sense that, as Gung said, it's not a competition in that sense. If you look at fund domicile and where you're choosing your location, like Tapiwa said, you look at many other things, and Luxembourg and Ireland are both part of the EU and they're in competition all the time. So it's not based on Brexit that you have that competition necessarily. Obviously in the asset management space and my role as a kind of product and operationally speaking, that what I say here is more in that sense. And I think there's things that are not necessarily linked to the regulatory changes that can happen post-Brexit and the kind of newfound freedoms, but rather the things that even happened last year with the review of the UK funds regime, that other aspects of that can be more beneficial. So if you think about things that haven't been implemented, but they said they would look at, allowing distributions from capital from funds, looking at the multi-asset funds and how the tax aspects of that can cause complexities around administration. So I don't think necessarily you need to look at the big framework of the regulatory freedoms and now that you have and the big changes you might make. There's simpler things that can happen along the way that are not linked to Brexit that can actually help attract more fund domiciliation here. The only other thing I would say is that I think Paul mentioned the last one and Jessica mentioned it as well. There are other areas you can look at in the programmable crystal ball. Compliance by design. Why don't they differentiate by looking more at that and how we can use all the valuable information we get from CRS reporting, FATCA report, well, FATCA obviously to US, but using that to help investors actually comply without them needing to have that extra step of having to hire people to do that for them, and it's all done by design. I think there are areas that you can use that useful information you're getting through transparency, as Justin said, the transparency, automatic exchange information, the way of describing it, and just helping people, but not necessarily going into how can we differentiate through regulatory changes.
Yeah, interestingly, on transparency, I know when people are looking at examples of Brexit benefits in the tax system, or people are looking to point at nefarious reasons why the UK left the EU, one of them is the fact that we're now not adopting. We didn't adopt the majority of DAC 6, for example. DAC 7 is sort of out of scope. Do you think these are these Brexit benefits? Are these things that actually have a sort of day-to-day impact on how you're running things?
I think as Kunke said, being out of the EU doesn't necessarily bring you out of all the other international tax regulations that come into play, especially the OECD-driven ones. So you talked about DAC 7. DAC 7 implemented through the EU directive, and one interesting point I want to make on that one is this is where the UK was able to have a slight nuance. So in the implementation in the EU, they also brought in a small piece whereby they're enforcing financial institutions to report to investors every single year exactly what's been reported to the tax authorities. And that really has created an administrative burden on, operationally speaking, for any asset manager, fund manager, or other financial institution. The UK are implementing DAC 7 as well through, I can't remember, I have it written down here, through the digital platforms operations regulation. But what they didn't introduce, that small piece where you have to report to investors every single year, each time exactly what's being reported. So from an operation perspective, it's slightly easier. So they have diverged slightly, but that's only one small example of something that's operational. And on the flip side, you can say as someone who has UK products and Lux products, just creates complexity when you have to train people who have to look at one set of regimes and the very same one in a different way in a different country. So the divergence can be good and bad at the same time.
Yeah, and in terms of actually managing teams, and it'd be a question for you and Tapiwa, I think one of the things that I've noticed amongst my colleagues and amongst my clients is that since we left the EU, that the focus of UK-based people on EU law, which is every bit as relevant for them as it was before, has dropped a bit. And I often find myself having to remind people that they ought to be following what's going on, what directives are out there, what's being discussed, etc., because it's still very relevant. I don't know if you found that's been the case, Tapiwa, for example, in your team.
So no, frankly, mainly because all the products that say I would manufacture is immediately premised on the idea that it'll be marketed in the EU, and that the investment strategies likewise might derive from the EU also. So there is no single product that I have that is entirely UK focused. So I think more about Europe than I do about, say, what's going on in, say, the UK fund industry and the law that's changing here. So yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that's a product of the role you're in and the business that you're running. But before I come on to, I suppose it's the 1-0, 1-1 -1 kind of question in terms of the future, and particularly the future of London as sort of financial services capital. I'm interested in just exploring missed opportunities or future opportunities. So this is sort of this is optimistic crystal ball. But imagine you're a committed Brexiteer and you're looking for, you've been sort of reporting to Jacob Rees-Mogg on Brexit opportunities, and you're looking for something in financial services. What are the things, with a particular focus obviously on the tax system, but more broadly as well, if you're interested, what are the things you think we haven't done yet that we could actually do that would either make people's lives easier or would position UK to be competitive in the future? And a question for all of you, maybe to start with from a sort of EU or external perspective, Kunka, is there anything that you think the UK could be doing or that the EU fears that the UK might do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, certainly there are a lot of things that can be made. I mean, for me, like the most important thing is that we keep the dialogue between the EU and the UK and that we try to work together. I mean, because I mentioned all those global problems. So I think ideally you still find the way to find like a common solution. I know it's hard, but this is something that I would wish for example.
Yeah. Tapiwa?
I'm thinking that when the industry was asked by, I think it was the Treasury, like what we were looking for, and the answer from a tax perspective was get rid of VAT on management fees, which obviously the Treasury couldn't afford to do. What I would say is an opportunity, and to a certain extent, the Treasury is exploring it, is that it's horribly complicated, particularly on the alternative side of the asset management spectrum, to structure funds. Extracting, say, the income and gains from very complex strategies in a tax efficient way and transmitting those up to investors in a tax efficient way. If you're looking at Luxembourg, say, for example, in a holding vehicle there, you've got multiple instruments in this vehicle. It's capitalized by, say, profit participating notes, CPEX, alphabet shares, et cetera, et cetera. Really, really complicated stuff that, I mean, keeps me employed. It pays my mortgage, but like, quite frankly, is not necessary. One opportunity that the UK could do and is exploring in the asset holding company is just simplifying that, recognizing the fact that like we can probably extract those income and gains quite well with complexity, or we can do it easily. If you make it easy, you have a solution that like helps financial services. I wouldn't say that's necessarily a Brexit gain because we could have done that before. But it's something that is being explored, and I have to give the thumbs up for that.
Any thoughts from you, Patrick?
I think, well, Tapiwa stole it with the zero rate for fund management fees. That was a big one. No, in general, I think we need to go back to what Paul said earlier. You used the words, I think it was think big, long game. I think with this even title, I keep on coming back to title because I completely disagree with it. It's that everyone thought overnight there was going to be big changes, but when you make a change, it in itself is already a big change, not just for the financial service industry. Things are going to take time. And so I think not having seen big movements over the last 4 or 5 years is not a shock. And I think you need to think long term. I'm coming from a long-term investment house, so maybe that's just ingrained in me. I need to think about what changes are going to make sense for the long term. And so things like expecting there to be a huge uptick in funds coming to the UK and making big regulatory changes in the space of 3 or 4 years is just not possible, because I think the law that came in, was it this year in June 23 for the Financial Services and Markets Bill. So it's only now you can start to unwind some of the EU laws that are in there and then put in place things that make sense for the longer term. What those are, I think Paul and the last group just mentioned a lot of things that will make sense around digital financial services and that. For me, in this like traditional fund industry, there's just smaller things that can be done. So you have tax elected funds, very little uptake here, which could help for multi-asset funds and how you stream interest and things like that. They're just not done. It's not taken up by most of the industry. So why is that? Understand that and then implement something that can bring multi-asset funds to the UK. So for me, it's not about why we haven't seen anything. It's about taking the time to decide what you want to see and then implementing that.
So can I jump in with a bit of a defense of the title and the idea that like we haven't necessarily seen anything? I think it's a bit like Y2K, how like on the first day of the new millennium, everybody said, well, why was Y2K such a big deal? Nothing happened. And it ignores the fact that in the run up to it, there were people working 24 hours a day to make sure that it was okay. So one of the reasons I would say that like there was no cliff edge when we Brexited was that there were a lot of people working in the background. For example, we would set up subsidiaries to handle the fact that like we couldn't distribute under MiFID anymore. We were reorganizing like how it was that like, say, the withholding was going to work. We did quite a bit of work in the run up to it to avoid that cliff edge. So that it didn't happen doesn't mean that like Brexit wasn't a big deal. It was a lot of work.
Yeah, I saw that in the, I worked with a lot of life sciences, pharmaceutical companies in the run up to Brexit, another very heavily regulated, or European regulated industry. And most of the large pharma companies did a huge amount of work to make sure that they had the right licenses in place before things happened. And they knew that they were going to need to do that because we had live instances of Swiss companies, obviously Switzerland not in the EU either, having drugs stopped at the border because they weren't complying with new EU rules that they weren't aware of, and having to restructure themselves in the same way that companies then had to for Brexit. So you're absolutely right. That's the trouble when an industry is well prepared, it kind of looks like it was a bit of a damp squib. It's like the wars that never happened. Well, the reason they didn't happen was because people worked hard to make sure they didn't happen. Looking long term then, and thinking about where the UK financial services industry might be in 10 years, 20 years, in the same way as we might be looking at other industries that were heavily EU regulated or that were heavily dependent on EU supply chains. What do you, from your perspective, what do you think the role of the UK is going to be, and to what extent is some sort of further dilution of our sort of financial capital of Europe status inevitable, or is that something that can be avoided? So maybe starting with you, Patrick, and I'll go along.
Well, to be honest, we're relatively new to the UK market, so we only launched our first UK products earlier this year. So all of our experience is actually after the fact. But the UK is still one of the biggest markets out there. I think it's second after the US. And so that's not going to disappear. So from my perspective, I think it's simply about making sure that there's products available and that are relevant for the market that we're currently in and the time we're in, and that they continue to look kind of towards the future, human-led, technology-enabled type discussions that go on, so that tax isn't really a hindrance, but rather is just a seamless part of the industry. And I go back to what I said earlier, compliance by design is something whereby investors, people mostly want to be compliant. And so if we can help them in that already is a good argument to say why the UK stands out as an industry. If you're setting up products for local distribution and you have compliance by design, I think it stands out for your investors, stands out for you. And come back to what Rebecca said earlier around ESG, tax is slowly but surely coming up the ladder in ESG, and you can stand out in that S&G space as well.
And Tapiwa, your view 10, 15 years down the line, what's it going to look like?
So what I would say is like back to the axis that Kunka set out about stability versus dynamism, and that the EU errs on the side of stability. The UK has been, and I think will continue to be, a source of, say, financial innovation. The capital markets are changing like quite a bit right now. If you're out there, you'll recognize that the traditional financial saving infrastructure was based on transferable securities and all of that, which don't provide the sorts of protections that investors currently need. Say, for example, if you want inflation protection, you're not getting that from equities and bonds, you're getting that from your alternatives. All of that thinking, or much of that thinking, is here in London. I think we have a service that we can offer to our EU partners. So rather than divergence versus convergence, I think there's an opportunity for cooperation there, because it works in all of our favors to help develop these products and address the fact that, like, we are all going to need to retire. We need the sorts of instruments that are going to help us retire. And if the expertise in developing those is in London, and the demand for those is in the EU, that's a perfect opportunity for a trade and for cooperation.
And Kunka, would you say that appetite is there? Is this more like the Ryder Cup? It's Europe, including the UK, versus 1-0 Europe versus the US. But is there that appetite, or is the EU way of thinking that we need to build up those skills and those capabilities separately so we're not dependent on London?
I mean, I think that we can just be independent, and we have our history, but I think that we also have our future, and we also have the presence, of course. And I mean, if you think about the impact of Brexit, I think that it's fair to differentiate among short-term, medium-term, and long-term effects. And obviously, like the short-term perspective is probably more pessimistic. It makes sense. And there are like many reasons for this. For example, like this, I mean, and even though it's obvious that London will not collapse as a financial center, it's also inevitable that some, if not many, of the capital's financial firms will move elsewhere, probably to Europe, because of the access to the single market. And I think this is also something that is happening, and I think that you all can confirm this. That investment banks, for example, have already begun shifting or preparing to shift. And there was a report, I think, by PricewaterhouseCoopers, and they estimate that up to 100,000 financial sector jobs may leave the country as a result of Brexit. And also something that I think all panelists mentioned are those dual regulatory frameworks. I mean, they increase, of course, the compliance costs. It's like enormous. But then at the same time, if we concentrate on the medium and on the long-term effects, I mean, yes, London's role might decline a little bit in significance, but of course, I think that it will remain a very important financial center. I mean, it already survived 2 world wars. There were many crises. I think it will survive also now. And I mean, of course, there are also like options to probably for London to reinvent itself, maybe create a better ecosystem for financial firms. I don't know. I mean, it depends. In the meantime, it's also obvious that some countries take advantage of this, and the EU is taking advantage of this exactly because of the stability for the business. So maybe, I mean, my personal opinion is I think that, of course, London will remain one of the global financial powerhouses. And I think this is inevitable because the city's significance is rooted in its amazing infrastructure, but also and the deep talent pool. And if I look at the people here attending the conference, I mean, this is just an example of this. So yeah, so I think it's inevitable.
Thanks. So I've had the nod or the warning that it's the lunch gong is sounding. So I think we're ready to wrap up now. I've got one final question, which would be very quick answers, which is that I'd like each of you to tell me if you think the UK is going to be rejoining the EU anytime soon, and what date you would put on it. So Kunka, start with you.
Everything's possible.
Tapiwa?
2037.
2037, very precise. Thank you. Any advance on that?
I just don't think it's half time. I think it's still the first 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a long time. Thanks a lot.